Over the next 30 minutes, we will showcase how Microsoft provides the most comprehensive set of tooling for cloud development and innovation with Power Platform and Azure. We'll also take your audience questions live. This is Microsoft Ignite into Focus. Let's go, people. Lost into focus. That's what I'm talking about. Woo. Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Caruana Katimu. In this session, we'll dive deep into how you can leverage the power of Microsoft to meet diverse business and development needs. We'll save time at the end for question and answer, both for our in-room attendees and for our digital audience. Submit your questions into the chat. Joining me today is the perfect person and one of the people that I fangirl over to help us learn more about innovating with Power Apps in Azure. Please welcome General Manager of Developer and Admin Experiences, Julie Strauss.
Thank you.
Please have a seat.
Thank you, Caruana. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. This is so exciting. We get to be online with people. We get to be in the room with people. I'm really loving this.
I know, and I'm so excited I got even invited back.
I know. Exactly.
That's a second chance.
It is. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So, Julie, we say that Microsoft provides this comprehensive cloud developer platform. What does that really mean? Can you, break that down for us?
Yeah, well, living in this ever-changing world, innovation is more important than ever, and it doesn't really matter whether you are a large organization or a small one. And if you look at Microsoft as a vendor, we're really the only vendor that provides this comprehensive experience for developers, starting all the way from people who write codes all the way to those who does not.
Right.
So that comprehensive inclusiveness of different type of developers. And when we're thinking about the theme for this conference, doing more with less, I feel it's really for this session. It all comes together.
Absolutely. There are so many different flavors, right? Pro dev in the middle, people like me in the middle who, yes, we can, but not maybe my favorite thing to do. But also, really being inclusive of people learning this skill who are coming into the space right now. I think that this is, such a great career development moment for everyone.
Yeah, and I think when we look at it, if you look at that full spectrum, like if you don't have your coding skills, you can build apps, you can build even external websites, automations, chatbots using the Power Platform. And we can further extend that with people who write code, whether they are your friends or yourself, to further augment that and using tools from Azure, as well as obviously a developer division like Visual Studio and VS Code. So you really have this no-cliff experience when you're bringing all these people together in this comprehensive set of solutions.
We love that. We love bringing those people together. Now, when we look at the developer ecosystem, there are two pieces, the pro dev side and the low-code business developer side. Let's dive deeper into the pro dev side with Microsoft's Scott Hunter. Scott will show us an end-to-end demo on how to build a low-code application as a cloud developer, bringing in our code-first tooling.
Hello, I'm Scott Hunter, the VP of Product for the Azure Developer Experience team. Today, app development is no longer a pro dev only thing, and we need to leverage low code to help us develop apps even faster. Microsoft provides a full stack of technology from low code to pro code, specifically with integration between Power, GitHub, VS, and Azure. And now you can easily use low code tools with your existing pro code development platform. We developed a podcast app based on .NET, Blazor, .NET MAUI, Azure Container Apps, and more to showcase these different Microsoft technologies. Currently, we don't have a way for users to submit new podcast requests and for those requests to be approved. For this, we leverage the Microsoft Power Platform to create an approval app to handle incoming podcast requests. All these resources can be found in the GitHub repo, and you can leverage this to create one yourself. We will start by looking at our Azure API Management instance. API Management is our platform for securing, publishing, and analyzing internal APIs. This is our podcast prod API. Currently, we only have 4 functions implemented, but for our approval app use case, we need to add new APIs. For this, we will open up our Visual Studio project. We created a new extensions folder and added a new scaffolded minimal API. Within our feed endpoint class, we added 4 HTTPS endpoints that support post, get, put, and delete requests. And now that we have our new API operations in place, we only have to publish it to API management. After publishing it, ideally using our CI/CD pipeline, we will refresh our API management instance, and we are now able to see our new API operations. Within API management, we have the ability to test all of our API operations via the Test tab. Just by clicking Send, we can see and validate our HTTP responses. We want to build a front end to interact with APIs in Microsoft Power Apps. With the extensibility of Power Apps, we can leverage 750 built-in connectors or write our own custom connectors to meet our business needs. Here, we use API management to build custom connector and make it available to Power Apps. To create a custom connector, you simply just have to select the API that you want to expose to the Power Platform, select the Power Platform environment, and give the custom connector a name. As soon as the custom connector has been created, it is now available and ready to be used in Power Apps and also in Power Automate, where you can easily find it under the Custom Connector tab. Next, we want to use our API in our podcast approval Power App, where admins can either accept or decline incoming requests. To consume this API from Power Apps, we need to add our custom connector to the app. This can be done via the Data tab, where you just search for the custom connector name. We will implement some logic. When someone opens the Power App, we will make a GET request. For this, we simply reference the custom connector's name and the operation's name, and that will retrieve data from our SQL database. As soon as we hit Run on Start, you can see our Power App is now displaying information from our SQL database. We also implemented logic for accepting and declining our requests. For accepting the request, we will use the update user submitted feed by passing along the podcast ID. Now we will want to test our Power App. We can use the monitor to view different events happening in the Power App. In Power App Studio, we just have to hit the play button, and we can now start testing our app. I can hit the accept button, but nothing has changed on my screen. I will need to check what went wrong. As you can see, there's an error message in my Power App. Switching back to my monitor session, one of my logs is also showing an error message, and in addition, it tells me the operation's name. We have a new feature in Visual Studio called Dev Tunnels that lets developers debug faster by sharing running web apps and APIs on their local machines to a public URL. By setting Dev Tunnels enabled to true and Dev Tunnel access to public in our launch settings.json file, it will turn on Dev Tunnels. As soon as I hit F5, this will run the application with the public Dev Tunnel URL. We provide additional settings if you want to secure these URLs. To test the web API in the context of Power Apps, you have to copy-paste the Dev Tunnel URL. With this URL, we will now update the runtime URL of the API in API management. Before testing and debugging the Power App, we will set the breakpoint. Now we are able to run the Power App and debug and test our API call. As soon as I hit the accept button, this time I will hit my breakpoint in Visual Studio. I can even make changes, hit hot reload, and continue on the Power App side. The only thing now left to do is publishing my updated web API. As you can see from this demo, Dev Tunnels makes the inner loop experience better. Dev Tunnels is in public preview in Visual Studio 2022 17.4, which is now available for download. Please sign up and try this new feature and send your feedback on how this helps improve your developer experience. That was a great example of how low code can increase your team's velocity by rapidly building front ends with Microsoft Power Apps and integrating them with your ProDev apps.
Publishing that API was really cool, but I think what was most impressive about that was that troubleshooting scenario that they showed, because I just have memories of spending hours trying to troubleshoot some code and figure out what I had done wrong. That just really seems to democratize the process and make it so much easier.
I know. And I think what I really like here as well is, I know Scott, he can write code, right? We saw that. But even if you can write code, there's just so much value in still embracing low code, where you can accelerate that cycle. And you see the investments we do in our pro developer tooling, it amplifies it. It really benefits the Power Platform as well when we bring all of that together. So I think it's a good example of there's no shame in running fast by embracing low code.
Absolutely, and also you're getting that in front of your end users that much sooner. Then you can get feedback, then you can iterate. Like it speeds up that development process so much. So how are we really, bringing this all together with Power Platform and Azure? I know there's more that you want to share with that.
There is, and I think key for building and offering these immersive experiences is really collaboration, right? And we have launched a ton of new features on the Power Platform to support both collaboration and this continued process through development. Like business users can quickly build and deploy Power App front end, as we saw Scott do. There's more than actually 800 out-of-the-box connectors.
Wow.
And with Express Design, you can even loop in professional designers as part of that Fusion Dev team, where you can have a design developed in, for example, Figma, and with a click of a button, you can import that into Power Apps, and magically, the UI is actually built for you. Super, super compelling. And then on top of that, obviously, all the ProDev capabilities and integration into GitHub and Git Actions for DevOps.
The first time I saw that Figma demo, it really is magic.
I know.
Could just make it beautiful and then make it work. That
amazing.
was fantastic. And I also learned that we announced yesterday some features to make the collaboration piece even more impressive. Like, what's that about, Julie?
Well, we are just about to see a demo in a second. Before we go there, though, we have co-authoring capabilities launching for modern apps. It's lighting up now in October and rolling out to all regions later on. And it is really, really compelling, and we'll take a look. And the company we're going to look at from a demo is a non-for-profit, Degree of Change. Yeah. And they focus on supporting kind of very diverse and homegrown leaders to succeed through college and their career. And they started with, for their scholarship, they took paper applications, obviously very cumbersome. So they developed an app first, actually code first, but they changed all the time, so it was hard to keep up, and they embraced Power Platform to completely transform that process. So if you're looking here at the screen, you will see some of these collaboration features. You have different users in each screen, and you can see the live presence of the users operating in the same screen. You can not only see that they're in the screen, you can see exactly which component they're working on. You saw commenting, which really means you can have a dialogue around your development process. You see here also on the right-hand side, a dashboard was added. The second it's added, it will show up real time for all the other people operating in the application. Wow. And you show like small sparkles. It's like any other Office application, right? Changes appear and you can see what they are. What is really, really, really cool about all of this, though, is when you're thinking Fusion teams, because we saw users already in the app, but imagine that you are developing an application and you need help from a pro dev who may not live in here. Yeah. By using @mentioning, you can say, hey, Kawana, I need some help here. And you will receive an email, and you can jump right into the app. So it's really helping to tie all of this collaboration together and make it real. One of my favorite features.
I love that, because it also builds the bonds between the different types of developers in an organization. That's really at the heart of Fusion teams also, is having that diversity of thought and approach.
Yeah.
It just makes for better applications, for sure. So it's amazing.
It is amazing. But there's more.
Okay,
yeah.
Keep going.
We have Power Pipelines, or pipelines for Power Platform, is something that we will be releasing towards the end of this year. Okay. Some of you might have heard about managed environments, which is really governance with a click of a button. It's more control, more visibility with less effort. But we are extending that outside governance to include the entire application lifecycle management, so that, and we'll be rolling a demo here in a second, when we are actually embedding application lifecycle management into the Maker experiences so that users who doesn't really understand necessarily DevOps, etc.,
Right.
they can benefit and create these very healthy applications following application lifecycle guidelines provided by the DevOps team.
That is great because, governance with the click of the button, you had me at hello with
Yes.
that because I think that's a concern of people, is the kind of sprawl of these applications in this
Exactly.
situation. And so I know we've got this. Yeah, we can take a look at this now too.
Yeah, you can see here I'm actually in the Maker experiences and I picked the pipeline. Normally I would just click publish, but because we have Power Pipelines here, I can actually only as a Maker push it from dev into my test environment. So guardrails has been set up, and why is this important? Because if you have an application, it's actually every IT person's nightmare. Like you have an application that grew viral, and you suddenly have, it's a mission critical. You can break that now and make sure that a Maker doesn't just push changes to production. We put these guardrails in place, making sure that you go and you test it first and then push to production. And every single change we're making is being tracked by a very solid audit trail. And we check downstream dependencies so you're not introducing errors as well. So it's really taking something super complex and building it into the Maker experiences so you don't even have to think about it. It just comes very natural, and it really helps kind of make for a solid development process.
Well, and I think also you've heard customer feedback, right? People want to adhere to these best practices, but they've always been more complicated. We had to be smarter than the best practice. We had to orchestrate that whole process ourselves. So I'm thrilled to see this built into the products like this because we know that this space is going to grow.
Yes.
So we want it to grow
Absolutely.
healthily.
Yeah.
For sure.
No, we hear a lot of feedback, and it helps create kind of comfort for those of you who are administrators who wants to make sure there's control and it's good quality app that goes out without hampering the innovation for the makers. And that's really what this is doing.
For sure. So what about, how are our customers embracing the collaboration of this development in real time?
Well, we have a very good example with us today. EY will be taking a look at some of their best practices, how they have developed. They have developed through a Fusion team an application where they took a project. It took them up to 4 months to do, but they're really using Power Platform as well as Azure and the new SAP connector to completely rewrite how they do their general ledger posting process.
Wow.
So why don't we take a look at it and see how they're doing?
Yeah, let's see this right now. Microsoft's Ashmi Chokshi interviewed EY's Emil Hofgaard about how they're leveraging all this technology. So let's check it out.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashmi Chokshi, General Manager of Digital and Application Innovation for Microsoft Azure. I am excited to welcome Emil Hofgaard from EY. Emil, thanks so much for joining me today. Can you share a bit about EY?
Thanks a lot for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm the lead of a technology team in EY. So EY is a global organization that employs more than 360,000 professionals, serving more than 200,000 clients, and operating in over 150 countries. So needless to say, it's a complex ecosystem. A core pillar in that ecosystem is global finance. Global finance handles accounting procedures and processes across 150 countries. Each country has its own accounting and reporting rules that must be reconciled, and everything's maintained in a large and complex ERP system. So back in April last year, the Global Finance Digital Transformation Leader reached out to me for advice on how to transform EY's general ledger posting process, which was a high-frequency, largely manual process. So we set out to reinvent this process by building a one-stop shop for EY finance professionals, which would provide a better user experience, built-in data validation, and enhanced processing speeds.
You know, that's really great to hear how EY is driving digital innovation for their most important and complex business processes. Can you show us how it works?
Sure. Let me tell you about PowerPost. With PowerPost, the general ledger posting process became easier, faster, and more cost-effective. Rather than preparing hundreds of rows of data in Excel, finance users simply log into PowerPost and are able to create, approve, and post journals all within the app. The posting process used to take 2 to 3 days to finish, But with PowerPost, it now only takes 1 to 2 hours, and data validation and transfer times takes just a few seconds. So let that sink in. That's a reduction of 95% in lead time and a complete elimination of emails and Excel sheets. So let's take a look at PowerPost in action. So here we're looking at the app, we're looking at the dashboard, and we can see documents that have not yet been posted, we can see documents for approval, and we can see document posting history. Now, what we want to do is to create a new document, and we're just going to create a single one. Let's take the FB50, which is the most frequently used. And a document header is created. So what we need here is information on the document. So we have company code, we have the document date, as well as the posting date, document type, currency. And when we're done and happy with that, we simply click Create. That's gonna create 2 line items by default, one for debit, one for credit. And we found that our finance professionals are working with almost hundreds of line items, so we built in a neat feature that actually allows users to leverage a reference document with documents they've created earlier that are reoccurring. So let's take one, click Create, and you'll see now that the line items have been pre-populated by a reoccurring document I worked on earlier. The app also includes data validation, so you'll see that the total amount in the bottom right corner now went to 10. It needs to be 0 because it needs to balance. So if I click Validate, the app's going to tell me that the document is not balanced, and I need to fix that. When we're happy with the document, we can go ahead and click Validate, and when there are no errors found, we can click Finalize. We're simply going to click Submit, and that's how easy it is.
That interface and UI is really cool. How does it work in the backend?
Among other components, PowerPost uses SAP ERP Connector and Azure SQL Database. You can easily swap out these components with other backend data sources or custom connectors should your enterprise be using alternatives. We've used the latest Microsoft SAP connector with seamless sign-on, and it's supported for load balance connections to scale to thousands of users. We use Power Automate to apply rules to the application and trigger the connector when to write back to SAP when the processing is complete. We also use SQL Database to import new accounting rules and logic into Dataverse. With the combination of the connectors, flows, SAP, Azure SQL, we've been able to completely streamline the end-to-end process.
Wow, that's fantastic to see how multiple services across Power Apps, Azure, and SAP are coming together through a simple Power Automate app. I also heard that you were able to create and scale this app with just a 4-people team. How did you do that?
Sure. To deliver this solution, we put together a core team of 4 people with different backgrounds and capabilities. This fusion team really enabled the innovation instilled in PowerPost, and their impact on this global process was astonishing. The core team was made up by 2 roles from the business, a global process owner and an ERP expert, as well as 2 technical roles, a product manager and a developer. And the pairing of the business and technical domain experts created perfect synergies to deliver this innovative solution. Together, the team defined the necessary requirements to set up a sandbox environment and complete the POC within just a couple of weeks. And after completing the POC, we pitched the business case to EY leadership and secured executive sponsorship to develop the solution you saw just now. From there, we spent 4 months on designing and building the MVP and integrating it into EY's global IT landscape. And today, PowerPost is used in 150 countries, delivering thousands of transactions daily.
I love this fusion story. And the core is still the people, the inclusive collaboration that enables everyone in the organization to leverage the best of technical, business, program insights. It's amazing to see how much more impact we can create by bringing everyone together. What advice do you have for others who are embarking on a similar journey?
Sure. I'd say there are 3 things fusion development needs to be facilitated. The first would be finding the right platform. Be the Microsoft Azure Power Platform or a mixture of both. choose features that allow centralized controlling. And then thirdly, I'd say creating a center of excellence, a COE, to encourage learning and adaptation of best practice.
Thank you so much, Emil. And before you go, tell us what's next for your team for EY.
As was mentioned in the keynote earlier, we're excited to expand our practices and accelerate digital transformation by bringing our solutions even more to the Azure cloud. Let me give you a few examples. So we're experimenting with Cosmos DB to host metadata in the cloud. We're also building custom connectors with API management, extending to logic apps to speed up the robustness of the apps. And lastly, we plan to publish the application in Teams to expand its reach to users within EY.
Thank you again for joining us today, Emil. I look forward to speaking with you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Ignite.
Thank you for having me.
That is an amazing story there. And I know that if you're joining us in the digital experience, but also you can find in the community, you can learn more about that online as well. So it's fantastic. So what I really want to know more about also is you've been in this space a long time, and you know, I've followed your work for a long time. And so I wonder what is really exciting to you about what's happening right now? It seems like there's just so much change, even more than we've been dealing with. What excites you?
Oh, a lot excites me. I think, I really think how, for example, the AI experiences come in, the express design, being able to even take a hand draw, like a drawing done by hand and import and recreate a UI on top. That's really exciting. I love the governance space, obviously, that is near and dear to my heart. We've really accelerated the work there, which will allow you to kind of take all of the experiences across Microsoft together as well. But I think what really, really excites me is the Power Up program, which is a 3-month free training for career switchers. And we always hear these stories about a person with a different career discover the platform and really transform what they do and other people's lives. And it always gives me goosebumps because it is just amazing impact that the products are having on individuals and how they work and operate. So I love that program. It makes me excited when all of you get excited. So.
Yeah, and so many people have signed up, and we hope more people will. The Power Up program is fantastic. It is free, and it's really a great opportunity to even just add these things to existing skills you have.
Yeah.
Of course, we're targeting folks who are new in this or career switchers or what have you, but you know, for me, I get excited about continuous learning.
Yeah.
Right. I think that that's such a key thing. So. Excellent. Well, now let's turn to our audience. I believe we have a question right here in the studio, which is fantastic. So let's go to that.
Hello, hello. I'm Ramon, and I'm a PMM for the Azure marketing team. And I just wanted to ask, do you see Power Apps and low-code software kind of being a way for people to learn how to code in the future?
Doing away with? No, I do not think so. But I do think we can do a lot more, a lot faster by embracing low code. And I actually think Scott showed a good demo. Like, why invest time where you can get a UI with a click of a few buttons? But there's always more sophistication you can do. There's always data sources you can't reach, where by including developers and writing code, you can extend that, right? The middle tier, Azure components you can build in. You can build, like EY had a beautifully looking app, but you can build your own custom component. So there will always be room, I think, for all types of developers, but we can always move faster, and that's what we want to keep focus on doing. So that's a good question, though. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And just being inclusive of all the different styles of, you know, however you got here right now, if you're in, you know, listening to us right now or later on demand, you know, you're in the right place because there's a place for everyone.
Yeah.
I think that's really the heart and soul of a Fusion team also, right, is having that diversity of people there. So
I know. It's very rare you see a solution that is perfect built by one person, but the more diverse perspectives and skills, the better the outcome, right? The higher the return. So
thank you for joining me, Julie. I really appreciate you on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that does it for Microsoft Ignite Into Focus. So whether you're just starting out your dev journey with Power Apps in Azure or you're a seasoned pro, be sure to continue it with Microsoft. Visit Microsoft Learn to expand your knowledge of Fusion development and use all of the learning tools that we have to offer. And don't forget to connect. There are so many ways to engage with the Power Platform and Azure communities so that you can learn from each other, right? Check out ak.ms Microsoft Communities for more. I want to say thank you to our audience for the questions here and online, and to Scott Hunter and Ashmi and Emil for being part of the show. I am Caruana Gatimu. Thank you for joining me for Into Focus.